Right, welcome to another segment of chapter 23. We're going to be talking about mechanisms of selection. Okay, so first we must talk about what fitness is. I might have mentioned this previously. Fitness is basically an individual's contribution to the next generation. Right, so one individual may contribute to the gene pool of the next generation, may not. Okay, the probability of that individual contributing to the next generation, if it's increased, that means that individual's fitness is increased. Now, natural selection, remember, is the only type of selection that brings about adaptive evolution. And it acts upon the organism's phenotype directly, but indirectly the genotype. Now, you might have heard these phrases right here, struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. They're actually misleading in most cases. This implies that there's direct competition among individuals for a mate. Now, this happens sometimes, right? We're going to talk about that. However, this is not the norm. Now, reproductive success, or the ability for one individual to reproduce, is generally more subtle, and it's not often at all really direct competition, right? And it depends on a number of different factors. All right, so let's look at some modes of selection. We're going to kind of look in reference to these mice right here. So we have these mice, and they have different coat colors. So these are, again, the phenotypes. And then we have the frequency of each of the phenotypes. So let's say we have an original population. And this original population has a very low frequency of the extreme phenotypes, right? So we have a very low frequency of the light color and a very low frequency of the dark color. Very high frequency of the average phenotype, right? So we have the average right here. Now, natural selection may favor certain genotypes by acting upon the phenotype. Like I said, natural selection acts on the phenotype directly, but the genotype indirectly. So remember, there's genotypes associated with these phenotypes. Okay, so let's talk about the modes of selection. There are three major modes of selection, and there's other types of selection mechanisms, which we'll talk about as well. There's directional selection, there's disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. So let's look at directional selection first. So directional selection is selection that favors an individual's at one extreme of the phenotypic range. Okay, so here we're going to compare it to the original population. So again, we have the black line represents the original population, and the red line represents the new evolved population. So you can see the frequency of the phenotypes has shifted to the right, so that there's a higher frequency of the darker phenotypes now. Now, directional selection could shift to the left as well, right? So there could be a higher frequency of the lighter phenotypes in the new population. But directional selection is selection for one or the other extremes, typically, in one direction. Now, disruptive selection is selection that favors, in this case, both extremes. Right, so we have both extremes where the frequency has increased. Okay, here you can see that the frequency has decreased in the evolved population for the average phenotype or the intermediate phenotype. Right, so we have basically both extremes see an increase in frequency of that phenotype. Stabilizing selection, we can see that stabilizing selection is where selection favors the intermediate variant. So if you look at the original population, the intermediate had its highest frequency, but in an evolved population where stabilizing selection is the major driving force of selection, you're going to see an even higher increase in the intermediate variant and even less variation, right? So you're going to see less of the extreme phenotypes. So here you had a little bit perhaps, but now in the evolved population, there's a much higher frequency of the intermediate variant. Sexual selection is a process where individuals with certain characteristics that, of course, are inherited are more likely to get a mate, right? They're selected for within their species due to these characteristics. Now, sexual selection can cause what's called sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is the result of basically selection in one or the other of the sexes within a species for these particular traits. So this results in phenotypic differences between the males and females of a particular species. So you can see that here. Here, the males and the lions, they have a larger mane. The males and females look different, even though they belong to the same species. Same thing. Some of the, often in bird species, the males have the brighter colors. Okay, so that's sexual dimorphism, and it's due to selection for certain characteristics, and often those characteristics are very bright colors and elaborate displays. Now, there's two types of sexual selection. We have intrasexual selection and intersexual selection. Intrasexual selection basically is direct competition among individuals of within that species of that same sex. Okay, often it's the males that actually compete for a mate of the opposite sex. So here you can see we have the competition, direct competition of these males, and often they fight to the death, right? Just for a mate. Intersexual selection is basically that mate choice, and it's really intersexual selection that can result in that sexual dimorphism that I was talking about. Now, this occurs when individuals of one sex choose mates based on often physical characteristics, and it's usually the females that choose their mate. Usually the males seem to not really care what their mate appears like, right? They just want to mate. However, in intersexual selection, it's usually the females, and this results in the increased brighter colors in the males of many species. Balancing selection is quite interesting. Now, balancing selection, we're going to kind of talk about in terms of the maintenance of certain alleles in a population. Now, in populations that are diploid, okay, genetic variation is maintained by having the diploid state. Okay, and it's in the form of having recessive alleles, right, that are hidden in heterozygotes. Right? So remember, the heterozygotes have often they always have two different alleles, but often they have a recessive allele, which is kind of hidden. And you don't really see the phenotype because, let's say, the other allele is going to be dominant. Now, balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains frequencies in phenotypic forms. Right, so the frequencies are maintained in a balanced, let's say, amount, perhaps 50% of each of the phenotypes. Now, balancing selection includes two things, frequency-dependent selection and the heterozygote advantage. Now, I did mention diploidy in the heterozygotes. This kind of maintains genetic variation. And frequency-dependent selection also is kind of the result of diploid populations as well. Now, if we look at frequency-dependent selection, the example in your textbook shows these fish right here. So they either have a mouth on the left side or a mouth on the right side. And what they do is basically attach to these fish. So they could either attach on the right side of the fish if they have the left mouth, or on the left side of the fish if they have a right mouth. Now, frequency-dependent selection maintains a balance between the left and right mouth of these fish. So that means about a 50-50 ratio, or 2 to 1, or basically 1-to-1 ratio of each of the phenotypes, the left mouth and the right mouth, are maintained. So this graph kind of shows that. So here we're tracking the frequency of the left mouth individuals over time. So every 2 years a data point is taken. So in 1981, we see that the frequency of the left mouth is up here above 0.5, which makes the frequency of the right mouth below 0.5, right? So then what happens is the left mouth is not selected for anymore, so the right mouth is selected, right? So that means the left mouth frequency will decrease. Okay, so then if the frequency of the left mouth is decreased, it's going to be selected for over time. And again, this kind of maintains about a 50% 50% of the left mouth, and then of course 50% of the right mouth would result in the same thing. Now, heterozygote advantage. Let's talk about some things regarding heterozygotes. So remember, heterozygotes is an individual that has 2 different alleles at a particular locus. Now, heterozygote advantage results when the heterozygote has a higher fitness than the 2 homozygotes at that particular locus. Okay, and remember, we described fitness already. It's an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. Okay, now natural selection generally maintains 2 or more alleles at a particular locus. So this keeps the possibility of a heterozygote still existing in the population. Now, the heterozygote advantage can result from stabilizing selection or directional selection. So remember, heterozygote advantage falls under balancing selection. So balancing selection is basically an umbrella category which includes heterozygote advantage and the frequency-dependent selection. However, heterozygote advantage can result from stabilizing or directional selection, a result of it. An example would be the sickle cell allele. So remember sickle cell from General Biology 1. So we'll kind of do a quick review. At the molecular level, sickle cell results from a mutation. It's a single base substitution, and adenine is converted to a thymine. Okay, so we have adenine converted to a thymine. Now what happens is this changes an amino acid. Okay, so an amino acid is changed from a charged amino acid to a hydrophobic amino acid. And this amino acid position happens to be within the protein after it's folded on the surface of the protein. So putting a hydrophobic amino acid on the surface of a protein is not good because that's where it's going to be interacting with water, and it doesn't like to do that. So this results in, this is the beta form of hemoglobin. So remember, there's actually 4 polypeptides that make up hemoglobin, and 2 of them are beta. So 2 of them are affected in sickle cell. So this results in aggregation of the hemoglobins in the sickle cell individuals, creating these long fibrils, which result in these very sharp edges in the red blood cells, which get caught up in the small capillaries, resulting in very low oxygen delivery. Now, in normal individuals, so we're saying that these are individuals that have both the sickle cell alleles. Now, these are individuals that have both the normal alleles. Okay, so let's say individuals with normal genes at both the loci have normal hemoglobin, so it just kind of floats around in water and it's happy. It doesn't aggregate, and the red blood cells are donut shaped and very smooth, so they can move through the capillaries very nicely. Now, let's imagine a heterozygote. So a heterozygote has one of the sickle cells and one of the normal alleles. So there's some normal red blood cells and some sickle red blood cells, right? Well, what's interesting is the sickle cell is resistant to the parasites or the protozoan that causes malaria. I'm going to talk about that when we get to protist. Now, an individual that is homozygous for sickle cell is going to be resistant to malaria, but then could die from sickle cell. Okay, so that's not a benefit, right? Those individuals that are normal are not going to die from sickle cell because they don't have sickle cell, but they could die from malaria. because the parasite can easily get into those and infect those red blood cells. Now, an individual that's a heterozygote, somewhere in between, right? So they're resistant to malaria, but they don't have as much, I guess, of the phenotypes or the effects of full sickle cell disease. What's interesting is that regions where the malaria is very common, okay, so this is going to be in these regions right here, so that's the dotted regions. Okay, selection is favoring the individuals that are heterozygous for the sickle cell allele. It's not going to favor those that are completely normal because they could get malaria. It's not going to favor those that are full sickle cell, that are homozygous for sickle cell, because they could die from sickle cell. The heterozygotes are favored in these particular regions. That is the heterozygote advantage. All right, so a couple of final thoughts here. Now, natural selection cannot fashion the perfect organism. Okay, so there's several different reasons why. Now, selection can only act upon existing variations. So these variations must be present in the population, first of all. Okay, so there must be variation. If everyone had the same trait at a particular locus, what's going to be selected for? Everyone has the same thing. So the selection can't happen. So there must be variations at the DNA level, ultimately at the phenotypic level as well. Now, evolution is limited by historical constraints. Now, evolution or natural selection doesn't just create new organisms with these special traits which are perfect, right? The traits had to have existed prior to that in the ancestors. Okay, so the ancestors, again, we have lineages. It's a process which occurs with change over time in the organisms as they reproduce. And then adaptations are often compromises. So there's often what's called a trade-off, right? So let's say an adaptation provides a benefit. Let's say that spots on a snake provide a benefit because they can blend in when, let's say orange spots on a snake, they can blend in when, let's say, the environment gets cold and the leaves turn orange, and they can kind of hide in the leaves. Now, these spots might make them conspicuous, let's say, when the leaves are not changing, right? So again, it's a trade-off, right? So it could be benefit and for one thing, but not for another. Now, natural selection is really can only act upon phenotypes which are the result of changes at the genotypic level, and these changes often are related to chance. So we have just change in allele frequencies, just a mutation, random mutation can occur, change in allele frequencies causing genetic drift, and then natural selection can act upon the phenotype that's the result of this particular change. And again, remember the environment matters, right? So this change may be neutral, but it may provide a benefit. It depends on the environment. All right. So in summary, I just kind of talked about, briefly reminded you of natural selection, and we talked about the 3 modes of selection, and then types of sexual selection, and then balancing selection, right? So balancing selection included frequency-dependent selection and the heterozygote advantage. All right, thank you for listening.